Hello and welcome back to the Double Take with me, Emily Carver. This is the show where we look at two of the biggest stories of the week, or two stories that you may have missed. This week I'm joined by Julian Jessop, independent economist and economics fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, to have a look at the IMF's economic forecast. And I'll be talking to Marc Glendening, our head of cultural affairs, about one company that's decided to go anti-woke. If you enjoy this video, please do give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. So, are businesses starting to go anti-woke? This week we saw one Florida-based jewellery company decide to go against the woke grain and come out with a new digital advert which answered the question, what is a woman? Of course, this was referencing or fighting back against the fact that many of our politicians, particularly in the Anglosphere, are finding it very difficult to answer the question, what is a woman? So this was deemed quite controversial, it went viral. Could this be a start of some kind of new trend? Could more businesses follow suit and go anti-woke to counter the many corporations that we see coming out with stances on Black Lives Matter or right-on stances towards eco-activism and general woke campaigns that they like to talk about all the time on their social media channels? With me to discuss this is the fabulous Marc Glendening, who is our head of cultural affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs. So he's the best person to discuss this movement towards the anti-woke that businesses are now starting to do. So, what do you make of this advert? You've seen it, you've watched it. Did you think it was a breath of fresh air?
Not entirely. I mean, on one level, I'm very grateful for anybody or any entity that stands up against the insanity of New Left thinking, and in particular, politicised transgenderism. So, on one level, it's encouraging to see that there are people who've got the courage to take this on publicly and to stand up for basic Western standards of rationality. On the other hand, what makes me slightly uneasy about companies getting involved in politics directly and using themselves as platforms to articulate political views, even ones I happen to agree with, is that this is leading us, I fear, towards a sort of tribalistic society in which all types of human communication, interaction, become politicized. And this is very unhealthy in a liberal society. We have to have ways of interacting as human beings which are not about how we identify ourselves politically. You know, if I want to buy a watch from a company, or in this case I think they are producers of watches, I really on one level don't want to have to worry about or care about what the politics are of the people who are making watches.
Yeah, why is this happening? Why are so many companies feeling the need to talk about politics and then promote a certain worldview, which often is seen as the woke New Left type view? So there seems to be every business seems to have a similar view on the importance of eco-activism, or they all seem to align when it comes to matters of Black Lives Matter, for example. Why do you think this is happening? We had Ben & Jerry's coming out for defund the police and for pro-open borders and all of that. Where's this coming from?
I believe this is coming from, ultimately, its root is the way in which a totalitarian ideology, in this case postmodernism, has managed to entrench itself within not only the public sector, but within big business. And so postmodernism sees all human interaction as a play of power. Everything is about domination. Human beings cannot interact in a fundamentally peaceful way. So it's the diametrical opposite of the whole idea, liberal idea, of the spontaneous order. And so what is happening is that people who share this ideology and have positions of influence within big corporations typically, as well as the public sector and other sectors of civil society, are attempting to impose this mindset, this attitude. And so we see within the Anglosphere, I don't think it's as developed in the Latin world and other places, I'm glad to say, but certainly within the Anglosphere, we see a lot of predominantly higher educated middle class people who now possess a fundamentally totalitarian attitude to life.
And also, and I'm sure you also agree with this to some extent as well, it's something that Dr. Christian Niemitz, our head of political economy, has commented on quite a lot. He said that these companies, they don't stand to lose anything by coming out with these woke statements or things that we wouldn't agree with personally on this side of the debate, but they don't stand to lose anything because those people who are put off by this probably won't be put off enough to boycott that company, whilst at the same time they benefit from all of the younger, perhaps more woke people on social media who share this content and who engage with it and like the fact that they have these companies have what they perceive as a social conscience. So is it a win-win in terms of their bottom line in that respect?
Well, it may or it may not be. It'll be interesting to see, and I'm not certain there's any way of testing this out, but certainly when Gillette, I don't know if you recall this, but they came out with some really appalling, patronising and fundamentally sexist adverts.
Toxic masculinity, I think.
Yes, about toxic.
Yes.
Basically, sort of inferring that all their male customers were potential rapists and they should desist from molesting women. As if most of us need to be told that.
It's like
by
there's a tampon
bloody
brand.
Corporate executive.
I think there's a tampon brand or some kind of women's sanitary product brand who put bleeder. These are for bleeders, right, instead of women, right? So apparently this was inclusive. So I guess that's similar to the Gillette thing in terms of, I don't know, social justice going wrong, going too far.
Yeah, well, of course, it's all about actually visiting social injustice on the individual, but that's another broader matter. So I didn't know about that particularly horrendous and tasteless advert you've now informed me about. But I know that Gillette, there was a huge backlash. So people like me, I used to buy Gillette razors. I certainly don't now, though on one level I hate being dragged into this and making this kind of, having to make this kind of personal statement. You know, my political life, for me, is should be a very different dimension of my existence. It shouldn't have to permeate all areas of human interaction, including financial exchange. But there we go. If Gillette are going to do this, then the danger is, of course, that what happens with identity politics of all types is that you get counter-identitarianism.
Yes.
And so men start saying, hold on a moment, we don't want to be spoken about like this, you know, go screw yourself, which is what I gather happened with Gillette, and they kind of withdrew the advert.
Yes, I think there is a financial decision, a calculation. There's a financial calculation when it comes down to these decisions that businesses make in terms of what messages they put across. Sometimes they get it awfully wrong, but as you were saying before, there's a hugely ideological dimension to this that many of these people running these companies clearly share, even if not all of their employees do. But I imagine they feel a hell of a lot of pressure to conform to a certain worldview that is being espoused by those who are running the joint in their media and social media departments, and of course their CEOs. And this runs through to the tech companies. Now, Twitter decided to censor this particular advert.
Of course they did.
Which is, again, it was eGuard Watches, a Florida-based jewellery company, who put out this video to counter the nonsense about what is a woman that's been going around. And it was given a little warning feature on Twitter, so you wouldn't see the video immediately. You'd have to click on it and open it. So it adds that extra hurdle for those who might find it distasteful or harmful. So, you know, it was given the science-sensitive content. I mean, what do you make of that? Are tech companies the worst in this respect because they're not even allowing the content to be shown?
I mean, they're ghastly, and they're run by all these kind of pseudo-liberals who aren't liberal at all in reality, and they're all about this kind of superficial virtue signalling, and they fundamentally are elitists who don't believe that other human beings should have the capacity to express what they really want to express, the equal right to freedom of expression. And secondly, they take the view that even the groups they are supposedly concerned about are in some way vulnerable and need some sort of safe space.
Yes, it's very infantilising.
It's incredibly infantilising to women and members of ethnic minorities, all the groups they have created through theory that don't actually exist in reality, because in reality we're all individuals. But they look at the world in this tribalistic, identitarian, what I would claim to be a kind of neo-fascistic way of analysing society. And even the groups they define as being oppressed, they see as being in some way incapable of making their own decisions as to what they are exposed to in terms of media content. So they put out these kind of trigger warnings, but they do it selectively, of course. They do it in relation to an advert saying that a biological woman is a woman. I don't think they would do that with an advert from a major corporation putting forward some sort of transgender insanity.
So you would boycott Gillette on the grounds that they have this ghastly... Well, you do boycott Gillette.
I'm sure they lose a lot of sleep about that.
They lose a lot of sleep. I mean, there is, some power in numbers. Certainly the backlash rendered that advert obsolete pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It got chucked out pretty quickly.
Good thing too.
So you would boycott a company on these grounds. Do you think that there is a trend emerging here? Could there be a trend emerging of companies far and wide deciding to actually stand up for what is, in our view, common sense and real liberal attitudes? Or do you think the power of this sort of woke social justice messaging is so strong that companies are going to stick to that?
I think the big companies will certainly stick to that. I think the logic of the anti-liberal ideology that big corporations now adhere to is such that they can't row back from this unless there are major kind of consumer boycotts which become empirically visible to them. So I don't think we're going to see what you have just hypothesized in relation to big companies. I certainly think there are opportunities on a more local level for companies like this watchmaking company in Florida, because of course Florida is a state, a red state with lots of people of Hispanic background who fundamentally detest
I think we've all got a bit mad, probably.
And so it might make sense for very locally based companies to wage anti-woke resistance in the same way, for example, there could be, say, very local producers of beer in Northumberland or Yorkshire or parts of the country where the New Left agenda, transgenderism and so on, plays very, very badly locally. So I don't think we're going to see it on a national or a global level. I certainly think maybe what is beginning to happen is that you're getting very localized resistance, not just in terms of business, but we see people beginning to mobilise locally against transgenderism, among other things. So we're seeing parents, for example, in Brighton trying to stop the local authority there imposing it on their children, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's very important that people feel courageous enough and bold enough and to come out and say what they actually think about matters. Otherwise, we don't live in a democracy, in my view, if people have to self-censor constantly. So perhaps big business and small businesses alike are going to help lead this trend towards a more balanced debate in public life about some of these culture war issues. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So this week, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, published its latest economic forecast, and it made for rather depressing reading. The papers ran with the headline, UK to have the slowest growth of G7 nations in 2023. They said the UK will be the worst performing economy in the G7. The economy will only grow by 1.2% next year, and the US, Japan, Germany, France, Italy and Canada will all grow faster than us, and they'll have lower inflation. On the face of it, this looks pretty dreadful. It doesn't look good, that's for sure. But is the IMF right to be so pessimistic? And what's the reality behind the headlines? Are we really doing that much worse than all these other economies? Here to give me a little bit of perspective is Julian Jessop, independent economist and economics fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thanks for joining me, Julian.
Thank you.
So how bad is it looking for us if we take the IMF's forecasts as gospel, if we can?
Well, I mean, to be frank, I'd rather not be talking about the IMF forecasts at all. There's no particular reason to think that their forecasts are any better than anybody else's. And in fact, also, they're not actually that different either. There are lots of other surveys. For example, the UK Treasury does a survey of independent forecasters of the UK economy that came out this week, and the numbers were very similar to those of the IMF. I think that the big problem with all these forecasts is that they tend to sort of hug the consensus. That's particularly true when you're talking about an international organisation like the IMF that is funded by governments and also has to take a lot of policy assumptions for granted. So they assume, for example, that the government doesn't do anything more to deal with the cost of living crisis, and in particular that there's another big increase in energy prices in October when the Ofgem cap is to be reviewed again. So a lot of the assumptions the IMF are making are too pessimistic. That said, there's no doubt that there will be a significant squeeze on real incomes over the rest of the year because of rising prices. But I still think it's wrong to single out the UK as the worst performer here. I think the downside risks to the main economies in Europe are much greater. They're much more dependent on Russian gas. And I also don't think it's a good idea to obsess too much about growth in any one particular year. Even if you do take the IMF numbers at face value, yes, we would slip down the growth league table in 2023, but actually on their numbers, we're back to second place in 2024, we're top in 25 and 2026, and we're third behind only the US and Canada in 2027. So if you take the long run of those forecasts, actually the UK isn't expected to do too badly compared to our peers.
How does the IMF and other organisations and governments, how do they work out this data? How do they make these forecasts? What's it based on?
Well, they all use one form of standard economic model or another. But if we think about the 3.7% that they're forecasting for this year, I've sort of done a few back of the envelope calculations about how you might get there. Given that we've already got growth numbers on a monthly basis for January and February, if you simply assume that there's no growth at all between March and December, then you land pretty much bang on the IMF's number of 3.7 for this year. And that's not an implausible scenario. It's actually consistent with maybe 1 or 2 quarters of negative growth, possibly even a shallow recession, as long as one of the other quarters or more is a bit better. So you can simply extrapolate from where we are now. You probably end up with similar numbers to what the IMF is getting. The difficulty, though, is that there's an awful lot of assumptions in there, particularly assumptions about what's happening to global energy prices. And I'm actually a bit more optimistic than the consensus here. I think that global energy prices will drop back over the remainder of the year, whereas most official forecasters assume that they're going to remain roughly where they are now. In addition, I think the government will do more, particularly in the UK, to ease the cost of living crisis, maybe a little, too little, too late. But I think we will see further action in the autumn to take some of the pressure off households and businesses. So I think a lot of the assumptions that forecasters have made are too pessimistic. I also think people are underestimating the flexibility of the free market economy, particularly in the UK. We saw this during the COVID pandemic. Each successive lockdown had a smaller impact because people adapted. And I think people will be able to adapt to some of the shocks that we're coming at the moment as well.
I was going to ask, what do these forecasts mean for our standard of living? What do they mean for the ordinary person? Because we see these figures, they look pretty dreadful. Even the projected growth for future years, it's still pretty slow. What does that actually mean for our standard of living? Do you think that we're going to see prolonged reduction in our standard of living?
Well, of course, standard of living means different things to different people. People often say that standard of living and real incomes are the same thing, which is a bit misleading, because at least if you're a middle or higher income earner, you probably have other sources of money that you can spend to support your lifestyle, even if your real incomes fall. So you can dip into the savings perhaps you built up over the pandemic. So even if real incomes fall, I think it's wrong to say that the standard of living necessarily falls as well. But of course, that's a sort of average across the whole economy. I am far more concerned about the impact of rising prices on low-income households, because of course they are very unlikely to have savings to dip into. If anything, they're likely to fall further into debt. And on top of that, much more of their spending is on essentials. So they have no scope to cut spending in some areas in order to continue paying their fuel bills and doing the weekly shop. So low-income households are most vulnerable. In defence of the government, they have concentrated a fair amount of support there. So there are lots of things the government is doing on council tax, on the universal credit taper, on the national living wage, that will ease some of the burden on low-income households. But I still think there's a case for doing more. In particular, it's very odd that benefits for those on low incomes have only gone up by, the September inflation rate last year, which was not much more than 3%, whereas we know inflation's heading for 8% in the next couple of months. So real-term benefit cuts don't make a lot of sense at the moment. I think the government probably should have done more in that area. But it's not as if it's done nothing at all.
It does seem to me they should have probably linked that to inflation. That seems to me the sensible thing to do. And the kind thing to do also. How did they come to this assessment that we're going to have worse inflation than any other G7 nation? Why would that be? That seems implausible to me. I don't understand why that would be the case.
Well, again, I think that's partly because of the way that official forecasts are done. They tend to assume that wholesale prices remain where they are. And they've taken a sort of an assumption about what will happen to energy prices in October when the Ofgem cap is lifted that I think is too pessimistic. So a lot of this is sort of a timing effect. At the moment, inflation in the UK is actually lower than in many of our peers. It's lower than the European average. It's lower than in the US. There will be a bit of a catch up because of the energy prices going up. But I think the idea that we're likely to have materially higher inflation in the future is basically just a sort of anomaly of how these forecasts are done. I think in practice that won't happen. I don't think the Ofgem price cap will rise by as much as some people fear. And even if it does rise, as long as it rises by less than it did last year, the impact on the annual rate of inflation could actually still be negative.
And we often see in the media that most of the commentary around this from economists does look at those energy bills and uses that as one of the major reasons why we're seeing this inflation. Why else might we be seeing this inflation? Is it not because we've been pouring billions into the economy over the last 2 years and before that as well?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a tendency to try and explain inflation by focusing on whichever prices happen to be going up the most and saying, well, inflation is rising because energy prices are higher. But that could be misleading, because the real reason why inflation is so much higher is that central banks around the world, including the Bank of England, but also the Fed in the US and the European Central Bank, have been printing enormous amounts of money and continuing to inject it into economies that are already overheating. So there is a risk that, I might be right about energy prices not rising as much as some people fear in the autumn, but that's offset by other prices picking up more. And there's certainly plenty of evidence that inflation has moved well beyond just energy prices and indeed just food. So prices of lots of other things, household goods and so on are rising quite sharply as well. So there's a risk that even if energy prices don't rise as much, we're in for a prolonged period of higher inflation. Against that, though, if you do look just at the monetary side, then monetary growth is actually slowing quite sharply, particularly in the UK. So it's possible that already a lot of that monetary stimulus is starting to fall away. And then we will get some pleasant surprises on inflation because of monetary growth slowing, rather than necessarily anything that happens on energy prices or the other specific costs that people are talking about.
And what do you think, just finally, what do you think the priority of government should be at the moment? We've got these forecasts that are showing quite anemic growth for the future years. What should the government be doing to drive that back up to good growth, what we'd like to see?
Well, two priorities, if I'm allowed to. One is a relentless focus on boosting economic growth. And I think that the best way to do that is through supply side reform, removing restrictions on house building, those sorts of things, and keeping taxes low. And stronger growth is the best way to fix the public finances, not tax increases or arbitrary cuts in spending. So that priority one should be a relentless focus on growth. Priority two, though, is to recognise that it's also the government's responsibility to make sure that the poorest are not left behind. Now, again, there are lots of things that you can do that don't involve spending enormous amounts of money to help.
Thanks for watching.
People. So, one of the big contributors to the cost of living crisis is, as I say, the housing crisis, and that's largely about a lack of housing supply. But I also think it's important that even if you're not a fan of welfare spending and are not really, you still have to accept that if you do have a system of benefits that is linked to prices, you need to use more up-to-date measures of inflation than the ones that we've been using. So I think there is a case for doing a bit more on benefits, even if that's simply bringing forward an increase in benefits that we know people are likely to get next year anyway.
And just one last thing, sorry, just came to my mind. We talk about the negative impact the tax burden has on businesses and individuals and on economic activity. How do we quantify that? Is there any way of saying, I don't know, if you slap an extra 1% on income tax or an extra 1% on corporation tax or on VAT, etc., how much impact that will have on economic activity and how much that could be preventing our economic growth from getting that much needed boost?
Well, these things are actually very hard to measure because often they're about the impact on confidence. And that's something that, economic models aren't very good at. I know that, several people do have quite good models here. I mean, our friends at the Taxpayers Alliance have developed quite a good dynamic model that tries to gauge these effects. And their numbers are probably as good or as bad as any. But I think the general point applies in any circumstances that there's never a good time to raise taxes, but now is particularly bad. When the economy is facing these massive shocks, then I think even if you believe that taxes do eventually need to rise, now is surely the worst time to be doing it. And I think even those people that do think that taxes need to go up in the longer term, I'm not one of them, but many people do, would still say that now is a terrible time to be pressing ahead with the tax increases that have been promised.
Yes, it's quite extraordinary. I saw recent polling that millennials, I think it was the group they polled, now think the Conservative Party are the party of higher taxes as compared to the Labour Party. So they've certainly got their messaging wrong, but I guess the evidence in front of us is that the Conservative Party is now a high tax party and will continue to be for a while. Well, that was this week's episode of The Double Take with me, Emily Carver. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below telling us what you'd like to hear about. Thanks for watching.